When I think of Hackney, I always think of Mare Street and Clapton. That's my Hackney.
I see the market, Ridley Road, which was the sort of core of a lot of things, Enterprise where I worked.
The Hackney Town Hall is just the image that stays in my mind. It's kind of like, for me, it just seems like the centre of my area of Hackney.
When I think of Hackney, because it's such a large borough, I never really think beyond, say, in my case, say beyond Mare Street. It wouldn't very rarely have travelled beyond the Hackney Empire in one direction, and probably no further than Stamford Hill in this direction.
The building stock is one of the most defining things. It's nearly all Victorian, late Victorian properties. For a middle-class suburban occupancy. But then overlaid on that, you've got two things. It became much more industrial, so there's a lot of light industrial premises in Hackney, and often in the backyards of what were once residential buildings. And then you have the huge expansion of social housing and council housing, so there's all the estates.
There's a sensation of a life and the sensation of energy.
Visually, places like the High Street here and Ridley Road are enormously jumbled, busy, highly diverse. It's an immigrant reception area, so we've had waves and waves of people from all over the world coming here. So you've got this extraordinary diversity. The other predominant image is that it's very poor, but now with a new class of people moving in, buying in here from the 60s onwards, but now really accelerated. So you've now got high-end housing built on what often was derelict industrial land and buildings.
I've met so many incredible people from around the world, and we all hang out and we connect with each other through our kind of shared community, and I think that's very, very strong in Hackney, or at least it has been.
And I've always worked with people who have come from all over the world, and they've brought their sensibilities in terms of creative and cultural sensibilities with them. For example, we're here at the moment at the Rio Cinema, and the influence of the Turkish community and the Turkish film industry has been really important.
Combination of cheap available space plus diversity, where, there's a long tradition here in Hackney in particular of dissension and offbeat, non-conventional behaviour. That goes way back to the early groups, religious Quakers and dissenters in the 16th century onwards. There's a long tradition in this area that this has been a home for people of difference of one sort or another to make their lives. This is the sort of place, therefore, that artists and musicians thrive on. It's that kind of productive chaos.
It certainly at one time in the last 30 years had the highest number of artists living in a concentrated area within Europe. And that was primarily due to the fact that there was cheap housing available at that time, and equally that there was a lot of squatting around that area as well. It was very, very vibrant. You had a lot of people who'd come from, say, working class backgrounds all around the UK or around Europe or around the world, who maybe were involving themselves in art as the first person within their generation or within their community or whatever. And from that, I think what it meant was that there was a certain attitude to that. I fear that it has returned somewhat now to a less working class environment, less edgy perhaps. But it was tough. It was, the pubs were tough. The environment was not one where, for example, the bars now are friendly to everybody. They just weren't friendly. You were made to feel unwelcome.
Sketchy was before. There was always something dodgy going on in every single corner of Hackney. But just because something dodgy was going on didn't mean it was bad. It was just the fact that that's what people had to do to survive in this area.
It wasn't a place that people came to live, even though it was very close to the city. Nobody really saw it as an area which to develop. The early 80s and mid 80s, the city was still reeling from a relatively poor period of time during the 1970s. And equally, it was only within 40 years since the end of the war, so there were still, areas which had been effectively bombed during the war and hadn't really been redeveloped.
A bit like the Wild West. When I was here in the 60s, we would play in and out of places for sort of hours and hours on end. Nobody really needed any money to do it, and so on and forth. Nobody had any control over the noise that you were making. There weren't, law and order. I mean, it's the flip side of high crime is that there's a lot of freedom as well. Richard Florida, who's written this book about the creative classes, always says that these are the kind of conditions in which regeneration thrives. So the artists come into these circumstances, low, cheap premises, chaotic but fruitful and very diverse and wacky kind of areas. And that's where things can happen in the way that they have here.
The rise of Thatcher and the development of Canary Wharf started to bring a lot of interest into the area and a lot of changes. Some were okay and some weren't. So, somebody has to suffer. And I think the indigenous people who were living there for a long period of time maybe felt marginalized.
Hackney is within a particular time frame. Of course, the Hackney that I now walk in is a very different Hackney to the one that I experienced, but not only that, but I also helped change with many other people, many activists. You shape a place as it shapes you, and I think one of the bits that I wrote about London in particular, it's about that, to recognize that you're not a passive sort of being in a place. You change a place, and it depends how you want to change it, whether it's for your own interest or you have a communal sense of it, an inclusivity about that. Communities shift and move, and that's always happened. So that's a normal process in a city, in some, always. That's the move, and that's the beauty of it also, of the city. But I think recent moves are so fast.
Perhaps most disconcerting is the rate of change. Because construction and construction work is now so quick, your landscape is radically altered in a shorter space of time, I mean, it's probably safe to say that most of the development now in London is doing as much damage first as the Luftwaffe did. Its destruction is changing the landscape dramatically. But equally, some things are good that come from that, housing, of course, but the relationship that the person has to their environment is affected strongly. If you're not in a situation where you're familiar with your landscape, or your landscape changes so dramatically in such a short space of time, it's not unsurprising that you'll be alienated from that change. It has to be taken into consideration, how people feel about their environment. And if it changes so radically, you can't expect that the people are not going to be affected by that.
I spent my whole life here, so it's like I've seen it go from pretty much the craziest area that no one ever wanted to live in to this idea where no one can afford to live in it anymore.
It's definitely changing, yeah. I think it's changing based on the kind of current needs and and the way the world is right now. There's a lot of development going on, whether it's business-wise or whether it's just housing development.
On the fields was very dangerous. Like the change for me probably was just before the Olympics, 2011, 2012. In summertime, no one used to go to London Fields just to like hang out and have a sunbathe or whatever. 2011, I was working in the music studio that was right around the corner from London Fields. We walked out one day, went to the pub, and just saw everybody on the field, and was like, where the hell did all these people come from? It's just one of those places where no one will go to in the daytime. People will get shot, people will get their bikes stolen, and if you see it now, it's the complete opposite. Everyone's cycling down there, everyone's hanging out there, having barbecues.
It's become a lot more expensive. Hackney and Bethnal Green have become desirable areas for which to live.
We're evacuating the poor to the outskirts, building high-speed railways to bring them back in to clean the offices and so on and so forth, and that is the pattern.
From an artist's point of view, living and working in that area, it was perhaps easier then than it is now. I can't imagine how a young person would find accommodation and studio space and then find time in which to work as well. I think it must be very difficult.
Hackney and East London in general has just sort of been a bit of a kind of breeding ground for culture and music and art and creativity. But over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, I've noticed it's kind of started to gradually decline as our cultural spaces are being shut down.
What's important to that is giving people access to time and space. And when you have to spend all your time working just to pay your rent, I don't know how you're going to spend time to think, and that would be a concern.
What we're seeing is that the poor and the creatives, the artists, are being forced out of these areas. The pressure is on, and it's already happening, and the artists are leaving places like Berlin, Leipzig, Margate.
They're moving to South London, they're moving to like Walthamstow or Leytonstone because it's cheaper rent, but eventually the same thing will happen there when the rents get raised to such a high price that they can't afford to move there, and then they'll just move to Berlin like the other artists have done.
People are leaving London because of it. It's becoming a concrete jungle, nothing exciting or vibrant or colourful left. What is happening is our cultural spaces are getting shut down in the very areas that they helped make desirable. When we moved to Dalston 10 years ago, it was not a desirable place to live. It was, the alley next to us was known as Crack Alley, and we helped to kind of regenerate the area, and now it's become popular. The land beneath our feet has been sold and we've been chucked out. And this is something that is a huge problem all over London, not just for cultural spaces, but also for local communities, housing estates which are being sold to property developers and turned into luxury flats, and people who've lived there all their lives are being thrown out and can't afford to live in the spaces they grew up in. And this is it's having a massive impact on the culture and the community of our capital, and it needs to be stopped soon. There needs to be some form of action taken on it, otherwise there's going to be nowhere else to go.
When people moved in, they made links with other people who were already there. They established those sort of commonalities. They brought their own cultures, so other cultures, accommodated that. So you had a somehow or another by itself, and it was slower in that sense, not maybe cohesion, but some sort of cohesion, some sort of accommodation rather of each other, and coexistence, and inter and across existence.
I don't necessarily think that to change an environment so radically so as that you remove a large part of its artistic community or indigenous community, then it becomes only a place that you stop. If it's only about your living accommodation, then you only live there. You don't participate within that environment. For the most part, artists who may have come into communities will engage within those communities somehow, whether by choice or by design. That they will work and participate in those communities. And I fear that if you're working, just commuting and traveling to that, it may change the environment where that's not the case. So you will end up primarily with places for people to live, but no sense of the hub, which makes the kind of toing and froing of London life so exciting.
There's nothing quite like having a space and a cultural hub where everybody can come together and be a part of a community. And that's also something that's very important just to human experience, the experience of being alive, particularly in a world that's becoming increasingly digital and we're increasingly separated from our reality and we're getting augmented reality on our phones so that we're gradually detaching from the physical experience. We actually need places like Passing Clouds and other music venues so that we can all come together and be connected in one experience with each other, have that human connection. And that is something that is not valued in our society as something that is important. If it doesn't have a price tag on it, it can't be important. The Ridley Road Market just up the road has been having huge problems again with developers coming in and wanting to get rid of the market, and that market is incredible. When you go down there, it's a real proper East End market. It's and of course it also brings in all the different cultures that come to London. You've got African fabric stalls, and you've got Jamaican fish, and you've just got all of the rich cultures of London just meeting together in this one space, and again it's under threat.
You see it in a larger scale, like in Hackney Wick, which is an old industrial area on the east of Hackney, which was full of warehouses, and it's been full of artists and lots of raves and all sorts of small traders and traditional light industrial buildings, which is the backbone of Hackney's old economy, now being invaded by developers for high-end development. And sort of trying to capitalize on the buzz and the kind of shabby chic roughness of the area. I think the fundamental issue is the economics of the housing situation. So long as housing and rental is expensive, which is massive. I mean, we've seen the most extraordinary escalation in house prices, and now we're seeing the government changing the law whereby people in social housing can own their own homes. Now, that might look in the first instance wonderful. They can own their homes, which everybody perhaps wants to do, but the problem is that within one generation, they will have sold those homes to the rich and have moved out. So I think the only way in which we could really think about holding that up is by massive expansion of things like rent control, community land trusts, community ownership, and so on and so forth, which, to be fair, this is something which the new mayor of London is thinking about, but the problem lies extremely deep in terms of land values, people coming in from Malaysia and buying off plan. The mess and the chaos is reduced to a certain extent, and what we've seen in Dalston, which is the proliferation of venues and cafes and so on and so forth, that's been quite spectacular in a way. So it's not as drab as it was, I think. So the public domain, up to a point has improved, and I'd say, schools have improved as well.
Things work. It's easy to, I suppose, lament that, you know, development has radically altered the city, which indeed it has, not always for the best. I don't think that there is sufficient affordable housing being constructed, but the infrastructure of the city and how to get around it, you know, the something as innocuous, I suppose, as the licensing laws, that makes, you know, the culture and the way of life somewhat. There's more places available for you to go. There's a wider selection of alternative places to eat, whether one is a vegan or vegetarian, whatever, you know. So on a personal level, the city is affording more opportunity because of that, and that comes alongside, you know, change. But where I would see the difficulty is if an area is radically changed or altered so quickly, it shares nothing of the collective memory that space had, which was very important around here.
You want a certain amount of gentrification. You know, we're not completely anti-development. There are some very positive sides to development. You know, you get nice coffee shops and nice music venues and, you know, interesting places to go to and nice public places that are enriched through money coming into it. But it's a case of balancing it so that we have some protection in place for the communities that have been there for a long time. Because otherwise it becomes a form of social cleansing. You know, it's not deliberate and it's nothing sinister, but this is the impact of it. If you start getting a whole load of money coming in and the houses rise in their price, then the people that lived there all their lives can't afford to live there anymore.
I kind of like the fact that it's changing because I'm interested to see what new things are going to be brought about. I don't know if I'll end up regretting those things or if there'll be something new and exciting, but I kind of like the fact that we constantly get some new things to experience.
I think we've got to recognise the value of gentrification and development and what it can offer, and also the value of communities and creatives who live in the space already and what they offer to the community.
Even with Brexit and so on, I think London as an international cosmopolitan city will survive. But I have some severe doubts whether it's sort of creative energies and artistic energies and a place where the poor can feel at home. I think that is threatened.
If we can manage as a society to build social housing in the Great Depression of the 30s or in the post-war period, surely we can do it now.
I hope that there's still a resilience there, that it will hold on to some of the past and the present communities and not be too distorted by the level of money, people who are driving the prices up.
It's fired up people. It's made us want to get more creative, to get louder, to get angrier, to get more passionate, and to make our voices heard.
The great thing about Hackney is it's got a very strong community and voluntary sector that has always been battering at the doors of the local authority or private sector interests to do things that they think are good for the community and so on and so forth, and opposing big plans of one sort. I mean, on a small scale level, there is the Eastern Curve Gardens down the road here, and that's a space which is owned by the local authority but also by the owners of the shopping centre there. Proposals to inhabit the Eastern Curve Garden started as a meanwhile temporary space, but it's been so successful that you can bet your bottom dollar that the community will not want to relinquish that space when the developers suddenly say that they want it back. And equally, the developers probably can't really usefully have it back unless they make a deal with the local authority. So actually, if the local authority ganged up with the community's interests, it could probably force a deal to keep something so valuable as that going.
I think it starts with new legislation in local councils to protect spaces that have been there for a long time and somehow benefit the community by being there. And that's why we've suffered, because we've had no protection at Passing Clouds from noise complaints from neighbours who just moved there, or now when we've got property developers coming in and say, oh, Dalston, that's nice and fancy, I'll have some of that, and just chucking us out when we helped to create what Dalston is now.
It comes back to this material thing about not just the price of space, but also who owns it, under what terms. It is to do with actually well-constituted, relatively small-scale groups owning the land or owning the premises and having a constitution which doesn't allow them to simply be bribed out of the market. Hackney Cooperative Developments is what's called a community interest company, and we moved to that form because it's what we call had an asset lock, which means that we can't sell our buildings into the market. Well, we could, but it's much more difficult, and they're putting a brake on entering the private property market and making sure that these places can work for community benefit on a sustainable basis. So there's something very important about actually not only at any one moment things being cheap, but also that you've got some ability to keep it that way and to keep it for community use. The way in which this space was developed, there's a 20-year history behind it of incremental regeneration, and the fact that the third sector organisations and arts organisations have a presence and also a legal presence in terms of ownership of this block, and have developed it very, very slowly, and working in partnership with the public sector and the private sector at times. It was developed not as a quick hit for profit, but it also did the Jane Jacobs thing of we didn't knock down any old buildings. We kept the old buildings. South Dawson Lane, it was a quick hit. It was Barratt Homes supported by the public sector as well, the City Hall, and it was built around a station. And basically, it was very poorly consulted over. The community was not on board. In fact, the local community was hugely opposed to it, and it destroyed a historic theatre in the process, the Labyrinth Four Aces, which has been a 19th century vaudeville. So it started in a bad way by destroying what's good about the place, because that place had been alive. It's where hip-hop started in the 80s, and it's got a long history. So it's a very bad start where you destroy your history and your culture in order to build something which is poorly conceived, because it's a sort of ravine of high-end housing, very exposed to the wind, very cluttered. If we have housing around a public space, certainly in London, maybe different in places like Barcelona, but here, quite often it's impossible to run the kind of cultural events and shows and noise and so on and so forth. It doesn't have that, can't have that vibrancy. And also, the people who are there, it's much more high-end. It's not as diverse. It's not a home for the poor, and we have plenty of poor, and we have drinkers here and people quite damaged, but reflecting the full buy-in to what could constitute social cohesion. South Dawson Lane is just not the sort of place. It's corporate, it's cold, it's poorly conceived, and it's started in rather scandalous origins by destroying a theatre and squeaking through the planning process. Local communities, groups and voluntary sector in this area have been trying to get much more involved in the negotiations and the decisions about where planning gain money goes. But the local authority is very nervous about opening up its books, and let alone working with the voluntary sector. And I'd say that this is one of the biggest problems we have here, is is basically how the public sector works with the third sector or voluntary sector. Public sector sees themselves as higher up than the community sector, and and they hold the power because often they're the ones that fund these groups, you know. So they can, if you start to kick up or become a part of the awkward squad, you lose your funding. The speed with which a lot of these more mainstream gentrification processes take place doesn't give time to consider the options because they're in a hurry. But the speed is not accidental, because if you're trying to make money, you've got to build fast, sell, and reap the profits. So I think there is two things going on here, one of which is you need to slow it down, but also, quite frankly, it won't work unless the private sector developers are not so greedy, effectively, are prepared to accept that they're not going to make this sort of quick returns, high profits, but they might make slow, steady, sustainable profits. We are seeing that there is a very significant sector which is aware of climate change, which is aware of the necessity for not just simply going for the profit motive, end of the neoliberal paradigm, where community groups and movements of this sort probably play are a very important part, building blocks of that situation. And if we've got a future, these are the things that need to expand. And I mean, I think the signs are that there is quite an upsurge in these kind of forms and these kind of priorities.